Welcome, everyone. Stronger Together is pleased to present this webinar as part of the agenda for the Global Forum for Responsible Recruitment, entitled Comparing Recruitment and Employment Models in Agriculture, Insights from the Field, the Perspectives from South Africa, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the US. My name is Rupal Patel, and I am the US Senior Program Manager for Stronger Together, and will be here to moderate and facilitate the panel today. The objectives of our panel today include presenting an overview of the models of recruitment and employment in agriculture for each country with an emphasis on migrant workers, sharing and discussing key challenges and risks that these models present in the agricultural sector in the countries represented, as well as in-country solutions to embed responsible recruitment, and sharing how Stronger Together and its partners are adapting approaches in each country to meet local needs. Stronger Together is an impact-driven nonprofit organization providing businesses with practical training, resources, business services, and collaborative programs in order to create a world where all workers are recruited responsibly and have fair work free from exploitation. We help you identify your business and supply chain's biggest challenges and deliver practical solutions to help businesses improve and demonstrate your good practice. By combining established international standards and methodologies with innovative solutions, we work to drive effective human rights due diligence in global supply chains. To bring the holistic change we are looking for, in addition to our focus on business solutions, we work with multiple stakeholders, including response and remedy providers, civil society organizations, and law enforcement and government. And at the heart of what we do are the job seekers and workers for whom we want to make a difference. Stronger Together is indeed a global program and has programs in the consumer goods, construction, agriculture, and wine sectors in the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, South Africa, Malawi, the United States, Mexico, and Costa Rica. I'm excited to introduce the following panelists who represent participants in Stronger Together's global program. These panelists represent a broad range of stakeholders in the agricultural industry, from farm labor contractors to corporate buyers, and will provide deep expertise and insights into their perspectives as unique stakeholders in the farm labor delivery system. First, we have Evan Caputo, who leads the South Africa program for Stronger Together. Next, we have Jillian Haythornwaite, who serves as head of policy for the Association of Labor Providers, a Stronger Together partner and trade association representing farm labor service providers in the United Kingdom. Next, we have Carolyn Fairman, Chief Operating Officer of Cierto, an international farm labor contractor currently undergoing Clearview certification, which is Stronger Together's auditing and certification partner for farm labor contractors operating in the United States. And finally, we have Jaron Dunning, Director of Human Rights at PepsiCo, who is responsible for defining PepsiCo's global human rights strategy and leading the execution of their human rights program. Welcome, everyone. Let's start with a few of our panelists providing a general overview for our audience of the models of recruitment and employment in agriculture. Carolyn, would you mind starting us off with the models you're seeing employed in both the US and Mexico, and also describe to us Cierto's unique recruitment model approach?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rupal, and thank you for including us on this call. I'm delighted to be here with all of you and looking forward to a great conversation. So thank you. So to start out, there's kind of two basic models of recruitment. The first would be a direct recruitment model in which a grower would directly recruit from the community of origin. So they're usually going to use like references from the current staff that they have of a friend or neighbor or family member who's interested in the job as well. And then there's the FLC, farm labor contractor. And generally they're going to subgrant to a third party. And that is how they will get an FLC, maybe from the other country. In our case, it would be Mexico, to the border or to the consulate where they're going to cross. Sometimes that third party will subcontract out to yet another, maybe a fourth party. So That's how they'll recruit us from the border only, because they're using this subcontractor from the communities of origin to the border. So both the growers and the employers of record will subcontract. So they're typically unregistered, unfortunately, farm labor contractors in those countries of origin. And because of that, they don't have a sight line into that process of how workers are getting to the consulate or getting to the border. So again, both the referral based process and the subcontracting process is where we have found most of the fraud occurs. And that manifests in the grower or employer not knowing what the true cost of recruitment is. So you'll see that, for example, commodity pricing doesn't really reflect the true cost of these recruiting models, because what's happening is workers are subsidizing a lot of those chunks of recruiting costs. That's opaque to the private sector actors, and growers can't see the commodity price as based on these faulty assumptions. So costs, to be clear, are still incurred, and the FLC may still be making their money. They're just not having to charge their client or employer. And that allows people to think that one FLC may be more cost effective or cheaper than another. The thing to keep in mind is the costs are being paid by the workers themselves in the form of sort of invisible fees. So they might have to pay the recruiter to ensure that they're chosen for the job, that they get a literal seat on the bus. They might have to pay for their transportation, their food to get to the consulate or to get to the border. Sometimes there'll be a driver in transportation on the bus saying, hey, look, sometimes contracts don't work out. If you give me X amount of money, I'll ensure you've got a seat on the bus to get home again. So these are these like hidden costs that the FLC does not have to spend, and therefore charge the grower or the client. And so it can look as if it's more affordable to use one FLC than the other, but those costs are still there. The other issue that I think is really important to recognize in most of these recruitment models and on farms is that gender discrimination really does touch every point in the supply chain. So first of all, women are generally underhired. Women's housing is an issue. There are few women in leadership positions and opportunities for growth. And these gender stereotypes really do drive all of these individual issues. And these can be really blatant, common kind of stereotypes that might come quickly to mind, and they can be very subtle. So a lot of education around that is needed. And in addition, now people are struggling to recognize and acknowledge, just even the sort of binary gender constructs, let alone the spectrum of identity and gender fluidness, and how do you provide housing for that, right? So this conversation isn't really even happening yet. And again, these workers are often hired through these informal processes, and that creates even greater blindness into this process, including the ease of fraud that can happen, and particularly relating to women being recruited. So in contrast to that, the Cierta model is actually, we're an international nonprofit organization, so we're very mission driven. And we are not, most FLCs, I think I failed to mention, are often the employer of record as well. And we are not. And we specifically are not by choice, because we want to really facilitate a relationship between the grower or client and their workers. And that allows them to have much more oversight of their H2A program. And we base our model on trust, transparency, and a lot of collaboration. So to start with, we do an extensive recruitment and training process with the workers that we recruit. So we actually go to the communities where the workers are from and recruit directly from there through third-party organizations that introduce us to those communities. And we provide an extensive training on what is their contract, where are they going, what's it going to look like, and what can they expect. In addition to learning, a lot of general, like, how do you live in this sort of dorm style housing? What's the culture like? What's the food going to be like? How do we be supportive of one another? What are the mechanisms for complaint? How do we manage that? So we teach them all of those things. We also work closely with both the US and the Mexican governments and that allows an extra level of transparency. We are actually a registered FLC in Mexico, and I believe at this time we're only one of maybe six. And when there's something like 400,000 H2A workers in the United States, I think it's more than six FLCs in those countries that are recruiting. So that's something that needs some improvement as well. Um, so we do also a verification of our recruitment process, and that's part of a big part of the collaboration that I was referring to. So we are monitored by third party like supervisors or inspectors that ensure the transparency of our process, including the absence of fraud, building trust, and building professionalism. So what we do is we gather feedback from the workers and growers to continuously improve our project. We have 3 surveys that we do with the workers along the way. The first is in the community of origin before they've left for their contract. The second is while they're on the farm and in the middle of their contract. And the third is after they get home again. And we do that because at least the first time around, if you're still building that trust, there's fear of reprisal, right? If you speak up, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be sent home? So we want to really ensure that we're getting the truth from the workers, and that if we do find any evidence of fraud or confusion or lack of communication, we can alert the grower, we can alert the client, and then we can also, find ways to improve our system as well. So our goal is really to make the program profitable for growers and retailers, but at the same time protecting farm workers from fraud, deception, and abuse that often cloud the use of this necessary tool in agriculture.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And I think what you've just reflected is, and the point that I want to really raise up and lift up is this notion of, farm labor contracting in the US and Mexico is currently an unprofessionalized service. And there's costs associated with professionalizing that service. And so when growers or even retailers and buyers are engaging on these like sort of cost basis contracts, we really need to recognize that the cheapest solution is often the most exploitative. And so really, I appreciate the work that Cierto is doing to really create transparency and also lift up this issue that this is not there are costs that are being borne by the worker, and that those costs are the reason for the exploitation of the worker in particular, right? And so thank you for that, Carolyn, and thank you for the great work you guys are doing.
You're welcome. I wanted to emphasize one point is that often a grower, is unaware of these extra costs. So they can have every confidence that they have a very clean supply chain and may just be unaware of these sort of hidden costs, and it isn't intentional. Well, that's the hope. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity to improve from the communities of origin to the border. So thank you.
That's a great point. And it's the contracting nature of the business that doesn't allow for the transparency. And so, yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, great. Great. So let's hear from other country programs as well. Jillian, I was hoping you could sort of help us understand what the key models of recruitment and employment are in the United Kingdom and what risks they present to growers and buyers in the UK.
Yes, and delighted to be here today, speaking to everybody, and really good to hear what Carolyn was saying from a US perspective. I think the UK is in quite a different place. The sorts of models we talk about sound the same, but the reality behind them are different. So we have direct recruitment, we have direct temporary recruitment, which would mean that the employer is employing those people, whether on a temporary basis or on a permanent basis, but directly in their organisation, so they're on their payroll. But then obviously there's times when they need extra staff where they would look for temporary provision. So they would look for what we would call a labour provider. And obviously, as you said in the introduction, I work for the Association of Labour Providers. It's one of the organisations I work with. And now in the UK, we have what's called the regulated sector. So the regulated sector is where to operate as a labour provider, you have to have a licence. So they're all licensed. They have to go through a process to get that licence. And there's a fair amount, I wouldn't say there's a huge amount, but there's a fair amount of due diligence that goes into place in terms of what they have to do in order to be able to get their licence and to continue And it's illegal for anybody who operates in the regulated sector to use a labour provider that hasn't got what we would call a GLAA licence. So it comes from the Gangmaster Labour Abuse Authority. Dreadful terms, we call them gangmasters, but that's what it's called, so we can't change the name. So they have to have a GLAA licence to be able to operate. So that makes us, I suppose, different, so that we know all the labour providers. We have information, we can do checks on them. So if you are a food manufacturer and you want to use a labour provider or a grower, you can check them out. And there are lots of audit programs that are in place to be able to use that. I think the other thing to think about also, I suppose, just to finish that one, is that it doesn't mean that there aren't some of the problems that Carolyn is talking about here, just because we have a regulated sector. I would say it's less probably because there's more visibility of these organisations and you can check them. But I suppose what it does do, and I know we're talking about agriculture, it probably drives it into other sectors and probably less so in agriculture. But there's always the unscrupulous ones that are there, and there are always ways of getting round things. So the issue of margin, particularly, is an important one, and therefore, if the client, so the labour user, has agreed a charge rate that isn't sufficient for the labour provider to be able to go and do everything legally and ethically, then the only people they can go and get the money from is the worker. So those things do happen. Whether it's as much is difficult to say. And one of the things the ALP does is we have a charge rate guidance, which is also promoted by the UK government, which helps labour providers and labour users to construct a charge rate that is ethical and legally compliant. The other thing that I suppose that drives risk is a lot of it is in temporary employment, is the types of contracts that the workers are on. So if you're an employee, you're on an employment contract, and therefore you have agreed with your employer that, I don't know, you may be doing 35 hours a week. So if you've contracted to do that, and they've contracted to give you 35 hours a week, and that's what they, both have to do that. But with agency workers in the UK, they're on what's known as a contract for services. So there's we call it no mutuality of obligation. So the labour provider doesn't have to give the agency worker any work at all, and the agency doesn't have to accept any work that is offered. So it's therefore makes it quite a loose relationship in employment status terms. They don't have the same rights as an employee in the UK. Their work is not guaranteed. The days, the hours are all very variable. So therefore, that drives a level of legal compliance and ethical issues that we see. It's also a very complicated area of legislation in the UK. Most of our legislation is geared around employees and employment. And sort of agency workers, we have the agency worker regulations, but then it also then refers to other pieces of legislation. So you're trying to apply something to a status of a contract which isn't the same, and therefore that means we get lots of contradictions, and of course that just increases the risk of ethical and legal failures. And I suppose the other thing that we don't have is as much due diligence on labour provision as we probably need to have, and it's not being driven to the extent that it should be from supermarkets and others. That's certainly one of the bigger risks, and I suppose you can't do a session around particularly agricultural labour without talking about the new immigration policy and Brexit. Our change, it's been a massive change to the UK. We don't have a lower skilled visa route into the UK anymore, whereas we would have recruited EU citizens to come and work in the UK, particularly in agriculture. We've only got what's known as the seasonal worker scheme, which allows us to bring in, at the moment, up to 40,000 seasonal workers, of which 30,000 are into agriculture and horticulture. And we are seeing a lot more risk in that EU citizens coming to this country. They can still come and visit, and then they decide to go and find a job which they're not entitled to do. And then we see unscrupulous employers, labour providers, who find them jobs. And so the increase in the number of the amount of illegal working has been quite significant as a result of the new immigration policy. And that has also been reflected in the seasonal worker scheme. Although it is a government scheme, it has rules and regulations. The operators have to have a GLAA license in order to be an operator. So it puts those sort of controls in. But last year, the majority of the workers came from Ukraine. And obviously this year with the war, they're not coming from Ukraine anymore. They can't. And so they've had to go to, so many different countries. Like Nepal, Indonesia, Philippines, so a long way from the UK. And they have very, very different attitudes towards recruitment fees, attitudes to immigration and people coming over here. So in most of those countries, you have to have a visa to leave the country to go and get a job, of which you have to pay quite significant fees in order to do that. So we're seeing an awful lot of recruitment fee exploitation, with people paying anything up to £2,500 to £3,000 in fees before they've paid for the visa to come into our country. So that is causing huge amounts of risk now. And I suppose the final one on risks is really around the labour shortages. We would say we've got full employment in the UK now. They quote something like 1.2 million people are unemployed in the UK, and we've got just over 1 million vacancies. So we're fine. We can just put the two together and it'll all work out hunky-dory. But of course, it doesn't work like that. The people don't necessarily want to do those sorts of jobs. They're not in the same place, and so, particularly in agriculture, it's not seen as the most attractive place to go and work. And therefore, finding people to do these jobs it is causing huge problems. And of course, it drives risk, because if you're desperate for workers, then you're going to look for them everywhere, aren't you? And maybe some organisations then choose to go to the route that isn't the right route and is an illegal way of doing it, but they get their workers. But it's just totally wrong. So I think that's probably what I would say in terms of the UK.
Great. Thank you so much, Gillian. And I think what's interesting about the UK relative to the US and Mexico is the legal regulations that drive compliance among the corporate community and the business community there. That's a real distinction. But it seems that, and I appreciate you lifting up also the labor shortage, because that is something that we're suffering from in the US as well. And so there's got to be this sort of understanding that if, what I always say is, if the fruit doesn't come off the field, nobody eats and nobody makes money. And so we really need to address the shortage that's happening. And it's a crisis here in the US as well. So really appreciate that, Gillian. It's really incredible what you all are doing in the UK, and congratulations on all the great work. Evan, I wanted to just include, you all in this in terms of recruitment models in South Africa. Is there anything to add in terms of how they might differ from what's happening in the US and the UK and Mexico?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Rupal. And it's great to hear the previous two speakers' input. I think in terms of South Africa, we've sort of got similarities just listening to the feedback they gave, but also quite a lot of difference. I think in terms of the UK, as Gillian has mentioned, we also have fairly stringent labor regulations, but our problem is with enforcement, or the lack thereof. But then also the models of recruitment are very similar to what you find in the US. Just from a background point, I've been with Stronger Together for about 3 years. And the biggest issue that has come out from the agricultural sector, or the highest risk area, has been issues around recruitment. So usually there are two ways. It's either direct recruitment or externally through agencies or labor brokers, as we call them here in South Africa. And each model presents a specific risk. With the direct recruitment, it's very rare that the producer themselves will do the recruitment. It's either the supervisor, the team leader, or word of mouth. Some interesting cases is that businesses have recognized that this is a problematic area, and because of the increase in regulations, they are favoring more and more internal recruitment as opposed to using a contractor, just because it's something that they can control a lot better. So the more established agribusinesses would have teams. So the supervisor with the HR admin would go out and do recruitment, and to get around issues around gender biases and discriminations. Some sophisticated methods, or I wouldn't say sophisticated, but very innovative ways, is they would get IDs from people and they'll drop it in a box, and they'll simply just draw a lottery, and whoever names they draw out is sort of how they'll go about recruitment. In South Africa, we've got massive issues around unemployment. So farms often don't have to look very far to find people. Many times they often would come to the farm itself. Perhaps another element I would like to bring in is recruitment through tribal authority. So in very remote areas in South Africa, you'd often have to approach village elders or village chiefs. So that sort of brings in another tier where the business would send out the supervisor, who would then approach the tribal authorities. And we've seen stories in the past where there's often a kickback where fees are paid directly to tribal authorities and not to workers, and that's also an area of concern. Um, Also, agriculture is not homogeneous, so recruitment methods differ from one commodity to the other. For example, in the wine sector, you still find a high prevalence of using labor contractors, or labor brokers, as we refer to them. And this, much like the others have mentioned, it's a highly um, informal sector. It's not well regulated, so we do have legislation in place, but the challenge is the enforcement of it. Some labor brokers have tried to register with industry bodies to help improve themselves from a business point of view, so getting certification and accreditation. But this is often quite expensive, and so many times producers would tend to favor the least expensive option, or only go with it during sort of auditing season, and then switch back to the sort of the guy down the road. South Africa, we refer to them as the Bucky Brigade. So these are people that essentially just drive around with a pickup van, and they pick people up and they drop them off. It's extremely difficult to get hold of them. They often operate underneath the radar, and this is often where you find a huge discrepancies or huge risks, because you just don't know, where these people are being recruited from and under what conditions. Um, Also, we've noticed that during peak season, harvest season, there is a need for migrant workers. But with a change of policy at a national level, it's becoming increasingly difficult for agribusinesses to acquire corporate work permits. So, in the past, we would have a high level of workers coming in from Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Mozambique. But because of South Africa's high levels of unemployment, the government is very much trying to move towards local recruitment. And this also brings a number of challenges, because in provinces that's situated close to the border, you can't find locals to do work. For example, in the sugarcane industry, local South Africans don't want to cut cane. It's the reality. It's backbreaking work, and the only workers that want to do it are desperate Mozambicans or people from Swaziland coming in with the prospect of a better life. So those are the type of challenges we're also dealing with, and it sort of gives you an overview of the space. In terms of regulations, in terms of labor providers, they should be registered with the Department of Labor, who then holds a register of all labor brokers. But again, as I mentioned, those lists are often not up to date. They're not representative of all the labor brokers operating in that space, and many times labor inspectors do not have the resources to access very remote farms. So, in a nutshell, those are just some of the issues, and yeah, some very similar contrasts and differences with the other speakers as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Evan. That's really helpful. I think again, this notion of creating quality jobs for workers so that you can retain them and recruit them effectively seems to be a really salient point. I mean, there's a shortage across the globe in this industry squarely because the job is so exploitative and it's a vulnerable situation for workers. And so just given that it's our food system, it's something that, frankly, just keeps me up at night. But in any event, I wanted to go ahead and just now include some perspective from our corporate stakeholder on this issue, just given that we've heard a lot of what happens on the ground. But Jaron, I really want to understand from you, what is the greatest challenge that corporate buyers face when engaging in supply chain sourcing and the subsequent labor recruitment that comes along with that? Like what keeps corporations up at night about this issue?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rupal. And I think that's a great question of what keeps us up at night. And I think it's been highlighted by the different perspectives of one, just how complex, interconnected this is, but then nuanced at the local level. And I think the one theme, I could probably pick a few, but just thinking of, what we've heard so far, I think visibility. We've heard that both, in Karen and Gillian and Evan in your comments of how hard it can be to truly have the appropriate level of visibility, and particularly as a company that works across hundreds of countries, thousands of supply chains. What does that look like as we go into that? Just from these three perspectives, similarities but differences. Now magnify that times 10 or 20, and then okay, that's your own operations. Then cane sugar across the globe. What does that look like? So I think this is one area that we've really focused on, is driving visibility, both within our own operations, as Jillian mentioned. Hey, our own third-party labor providers of temporary labor. Where are we on that? And then starting to go to that next concentric circle of okay, our tier one suppliers, high risk commodity supply chains. What are we doing there in that country? While we may have a global approach, what does that look like as we action it on the ground? And I think visibility, it comes back to that of really driving toward, are we working at the right level on the right issues with the right partners? As we think of visibility, and that's both from, we've talked about the contractual perspective of, okay, what's really in the cost, right? What's getting passed along versus being borne by the employer or the recruiting agency overall. But then how do we work at a local level and a regional level to really drive demand for responsible recruitment across an industry, across a sector, to make sure it's not any one organization or company going alone, particularly where we are a large multinational, but in certain countries we may be a very small part of a supply chain, right? How do we play the appropriate part in that, in driving visibility, accountability, and then really spurring action overall? So I think that's one of the challenges, just that's really front of mind, hearing the different regional perspectives as we think about some of the things we deal with on a day in and day out basis.
Great. Thanks, Jaron. And I think what's interesting is, as an industry across the globe, what I've found is, we're enormously reliant on governments to really help provide the guideposts that we're looking for and the enforcement and the sort of list of good actors. But that has failed us time and time again. And so it's really, a question of us as an industry, given that there's a consumer demand around this issue in particular, right? The new consumers of the generation of millennial and Gen Z folks, they care how they spend their dollar and how they spend it towards the people and planet. And so, I think it's an interesting opportunity in time for capital and corporations to come together and kind of take leadership on this issue, because it's impacting us so greatly on like economically and profitability and sustainability. And so, really appreciate the perspective and the participation of corporate buyers such as yourself, Jaron, in these kinds of discussions, because it's really important that we're talking to each other around these issues. Yeah. Well, now that we've provided an overview of recruitment models in the various countries, let's talk about the ecosystem of farm labor recruitment and talk about some of the risks and solutions there. So the first question for our panel, just given your perspectives as unique stakeholders in the industry, who has the responsibility for embedding responsible recruitment in the labor supply chain? And Jaron, I might ask you to just start off as like sort of from the corporate buyer perspective. Who has responsibility for embedding responsible recruitment?
Yeah. Yeah, Rupal, I think a great question. And I think as all of us as stakeholders, I think we all have a very important role to play, whether you're a brand, whether you're a civil society organization, or a recruiting agency, right? Playing a very important part in that. And, as I think about our role as a brand, is one to make sure we're setting the commitment and the tone of what we expect and actually where we want to move toward, right? As we say, hey, we want zero recruitment fees, how are we actually putting that commitment into action with our suppliers, with our own third-party labor providers, but then working with our suppliers, our direct agro partners to actually embed that and implement that into their own operations. And I think that's where sometimes it can be raising awareness, advocating, setting the tone to say, hey, here's where we want to go as a leader to push the industry, and then catalyzing action to bring others along. But then, this is kind of, where rubber meets the road, right? It's one thing to say, hey, we're going to do this as a big brand in X supply chain, in X emerging market. How do we actually do that? And that's by partners, by actually getting on the ground and having willing partners to engage. So I'll say we all have a very important role. I think, clearly employers and recruiting agencies have a large role in that, but as well as state actors. I think to Evan's point, a lot of the issues we run into sometimes, there are laws on the books, but rule of law is weak, right? And it isn't being enforced. So what is the right role of all of the actors to play in that? Would just be a bit of perspective as I think about, the various roles we all play in responsible recruitment.
Great, thanks. Carolyn, I'd be interested to hear from your perspective, just being on the ground as an agency and labor recruiter. Where do you see who has the responsibility for embedding responsible recruitment in the labor supply chain from your perspective?
Well, I'm completely in agreement with what Jaron has shared. It's an integrative responsibility. It's a holistic system, right? Everyone has a role to play in this. I think one of the challenges is, Jaron, you touched on this, like there is oversight, supposedly. There is the Department of Labor. There are institutions in all of these countries that are supposed to oversee this, but they often really lack the resources to be able to dig as deeply as they need to. If you've got upwards of 400,000 H-2A workers, on farms across the United States, which is pretty enormous. It requires a lot of resources to be able to really look into those models. And I think, unfortunately, at this point, there aren't repercussions for people who aren't sort of doing it right. So what is the incentive for people and growers in particular, to do things right? What is, if there aren't really repercussions and or you believe that your supply chain is good, but you don't have the tools yet to recognize where to look. And so I think that that's something that we can increase, is providing those tools to help people figure out where in their supply chain, where in their model might they find some fraud, and might they be able to improve their systems where they haven't been aware of that before. So how can we sort of help these other institutions along and take some responsibility ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Great. Jillian, Evan, I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts or.
I think from my point of view, I suppose I also work with a number of food manufacturers and growers. And I think particularly for food manufacturers, we've always taken the approach we have to get our own house in order. So we have to make sure we've embedded the responsible recruitment standards in our own business, then in our own labour providers, and then look to move that out on the basis that, if we've done it ourselves, then you can do it. So it's whereas it's very difficult to demand other people down your supply chain do stuff, but you haven't done it yourself. I mean, having worked for food manufacturers directly, where retailers haven't always done exactly what they should do, we've always taken that approach that, we want to get our own house in order, and then we go out and we talk, but also providing that capacity building that Carolyn was talking about, because it's difficult. It's not easy to do this stuff, and you won't always get it right. And sometimes you have to have a go at something and then say, well, that didn't work, and try something different, and then look at what tools and things are available to help you. So that capacity building, I think, down the supply chain is really important.
Great.
Yeah, I think from my point, it's one where obviously it's a joint effort, but it's also changing perceptions around employment and recruitment. I think within the agricultural sector, certainly South Africa, labor is seen as dispensable, and I think we need to change that as well. So oftentimes, if there's a lot of red tape around employment of people, businesses would go to mechanization or favor that, and that's because of historical issues around tension between labor and business and government. Where I think the whole point is to also ensure that we are creating work that is meaningful and that agriculture contributes to a society in which everyone flourishes. So definitely think it's everyone's responsibility, but it does also require a shift in not seeing labor as just an add-on or as a means to an end at the end of the day.
Great point. That's a really great point. It's really just not seeing, I think what we talk about in the US is not seeing workers as just pieces of equipment. They're actual human beings that are trying to put food on their table and, live good lives. And so, and that's not a lot to ask, right? Thanks for lifting that up, Evan. What about the role of brands? Jaron, I might ask you to opine on this a bit, just to understand, is there a role, and particularly I think about market signals as a really strong incentive to, get the supply chain to try to clean up, obviously coupled with resources to actually do that. But interested in what would the role that you see brands playing in this responsible recruitment issues.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it starts, as Jillian mentioned, our own house, right? Our own four walls, making sure we're actually living and walking the talk, right? In terms of the commitments. And then what's the broader role and responsibility? And I think we touched a little bit on that as we go into the supply chains. It's actually making sure we're implementing this, right? And that means building capability, having conversations that have commercial implications, right? We want you to do X. Okay, what does that look like now as we think holistically as long-term partners, right? Versus it being more of a purely transactional nature of, hey, I need you to meet X standard on your own while not taking a continuous improvement approach, right? And I think that's one aspect through our sustainable sourcing program, sustainable farming program, of building those meaningful relationships to actually build capability and capacity as a partner, right? And I think this gets, Evan, to your point on, hey, it's a shift away from this being part of a business model to a meaningful part of the business model, right? That we really need to deliver. And I think as brands, is setting the tone using our unique size and scale to help create demand for this, right? Demand for responsible recruitment, not only in our industry, but across industry, across regions, right, where we know there are particular issues, whether it's in the sending or receiving country, as we think of, migrant workers and some of the impacts there. Is it raising awareness more broadly to catalyze industry action? Is it working with local governments in, ways in which we can to kind of spur, stronger rule of law or better protections for certain vulnerable populations, particularly whether it's migrant workers or women or others who are disproportionately impacted along those value chains? I think there's a really important role for us to play in both, helping catalyze action, but also being part of the capacity building process, whether that's through due diligence and where needed by helping enable remedy, right? When issues have happened, whether that's in our own four walls or, in a supplier or a supplier of a supplier where we can use our leverage. I think getting creative there. And I forget who mentioned it earlier, but getting into these issues and actually figuring it out. And sometimes it doesn't work and it doesn't work well, and you and you learn from it and you take that and you take those learnings into different places. But I think these are particularly issues where you have to really get into it to fully have an appreciation for it versus, okay, we have the nice corporate policy. It's no, we need to dig in. So I think there's a particularly important role for us, to summarize and helping create demand, where we can, advocating for increased supply by building that capability, and then really advocating for increased protection, across the different pathways that we know are particularly important.
Great, great. Cooperation with the government is definitely, paramount in trying to solve this problem, and definitely appreciate how thoughtful, PepsiCo has been and sort of in trying to figure out and explore, creative ways to address the supply chain issues there. I don't, Carolyn or Jillian or Evan, I don't know if you have anything to add on the role of brands in particular.
I think from my point of view here in the UK, the collaboration between the brands, so the major retailers in the UK, so the major supermarkets on issues like this, have seen real change. So they've collaborated on responsible recruitment toolkit. They fund it. They fund it so that it goes down the supply chain. They also, when they get together, they can influence government. They can influence the supply chain. And we've seen greater change when they've done that together, not necessarily just one retailer, but not all of them necessarily all together, because that's quite difficult to do. But actually, when two or three of them get together, and that power of that voice really does make a difference. And I think for me, it is the top of the tree, and they push things down. But they've always got to remember that as you push it down, when you get lower and lower down the supply chain, there's less and less money in the supply chain, and you're getting to the point where the only place to go is to take the money from the workers. So, it's certainly something we raise as the ALP on labour providers. They only get money from their clients. If they don't get it from their clients, then they have to take it from the workers. So, it then needs to work its way back up the supply chain, back up to the people at the top.
Great. Yeah, I
would
do.
add that, I am in full agreement. I think that brands carry a big stick, right? They do wield a lot of power. From our understanding, retailers purchase, maybe 25 to 30% of a farm's, in agriculture anyway, farm's product, just to avoid the dependence on any one farm. Brand integrity is obviously very important, and the value of that, is something that allows them to carry this big stick. So this example that I have of taking apples. So for every dollar that you spend on an apple, 68 cents goes to the supermarket. 7 cents goes to the grower. 17 cents goes to the Apple Commission. 4 cents to transportation and 4 cents to labor. So it's a way to use that big stick that they carry to really, as you said, Jaron, influence the entire supply chain to do better and create that demand.
That cost breakdown is super helpful, Carolyn. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on, just to echo that last point, I think, the further you move down the supply chain, that profit margins are become extremely small, and I think brands play an important role to ensure that the entire supply chain is sustainable. And I think that really starts with sort of issues around living wages and moving towards that discussion, because rightfully I agree, as Gillian said, the easiest place to cut costs is really around labor, and we really need to start changing that narrative. And also, I see it as a cascading effect. If people see sustainability as a key part, there's no reason why profits can't follow in the long run as well. So yeah, definitely feel that brands have a greater role to play, especially in terms of their buying power and what they can do to improve a supply chain in a particular country.
Great. Thank you, guys. That was great. And finally, I just wanted to ask about what the role that audits can play. And Carolyn, I thought you would be great to just sort of start off by, get based on Cierto's, experience of, going through third-party auditing. You guys are that's very much part of your business model. What role do audits play in reducing the harm and exploitation related to recruitment of workers?
Well, they're going to help you provide an insight into your supply chain, right? So I think, first of all, preliminary research has shown that ethical recruitment leads to higher efficiency, productivity, profitability, because the workers are respected. There's a sense of trust and confidence built among the workers in an ethical process in H2A recruitment. Federal governments are really opening up to the creation and implementation of safe recruitment processes through policy, legislation, and oversight. There may still be some lacking resources, but this is more and more part of the conversation. And I think the industry is really ready to understand the vulnerability that the current model creates in supply chains, the negative impact that that can have on your brand, on your farm, on the retailer. And Data has shown us in some of our research that responsibly recruited and managed workers are between 18 and all the way to 50% more productive on farms than their counterparts. And that speaks to their sense of confidence, trust, and also the ability to be recruited year after year and rely on that secure income every year. So audits can really provide that snapshot, a diagnostic of your present model that helps you understand where the risk is and therefore where your improvements might be. The only thing I would say is that a lot of audits do struggle to find the insight all the way to the community of origin, where you can find a lot of that inherent risk. So the audits will highlight the reality and the need to engage in this ecosystem to provide the full oversight of the entire process, all the way from the community of origin to the farm and back again.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. And I think that's I find that what's unique about the Clearview certification process, in particular in the United States, is that most of the certifications that are available in the U.S. really certify the grower. And not the contractor. And what I appreciate about the Clearview certification process is that it's really auditing the contractor, the source of where recruitment and exploitation and such are taking place, and where capacity needs to be built the most. And so, really excited about Cierto's participation in the Clearview certification process, and we piloted a certification project among 3 or 4 FLCs in the United States for the first time. And it's really exciting to see good actors come to the table and step up and say, "Hey, I want to be audited so that I can drive more business towards me because I see that the market is heading in this direction." And I think this is like sort of a first in market opportunity where contractors are actually saying, "Hey, I want to come to the table and I want to clean up my services because I see the market potential for doing so." So, yeah, really
Yeah,
excited about the opportunity with Cierto here.
yeah, we are as well, and we're really seeing that we can offer ourselves as an example of a model. We're excited to get the Clearview certification and hope that that helps set a standard in the industry and creates a new norm so that we aren't the unicorn out there and we are one among many.
That's right. Great. And so I want to, we have we have about 8 minutes left, and this has been such a great discussion and just a wealth of information among this group of folks here. I just want to touch on a couple things specifically about how Stronger Together is working in local jurisdictions to really think about how to help mitigate the risks and embed responsible recruitment. Evan, could you give us just a brief sort of overview of what you all are leading in South Africa, what Stronger Together is doing in South Africa around these building capacity in particular in local areas?
Yeah, I think definitely the conversation has progressed to such a degree where 5 years ago, this topic was almost sort of taboo. When we started this program, when we first mentioned the term modern day slavery, it didn't sit really well within the sector. And I think we had some growing pains in the beginning, but as time has moved on, businesses started to understand this issue. Obviously, it does help globally. This conversation is happening around issues around fair work. What does it mean to, have a just and fair supply chain? And I think that South Africa has come a long way since then. We've identified a number of different needs. So that training at senior management level, but then ensuring that message gets cascaded further down. And what we realized around responsible recruitment is it's no use just engaging sort of management team, but also engaging with those doing recruitment, also raising awareness amongst workers within the communities. So really looking at what are some of the root causes and how we can begin to sort of ensure that there is capacity building across different roles within the business. So we've developed training not just for management around risk management issues, but also engaging with team leaders, supervisors, labor brokers around what is responsible recruitment in a way that they can relate. without having all that technical jargon, but really giving them a sort of shorter guidance around what are the key points when it comes to recruitment and how they can engage with buyers within their supply chain. And then obviously for workers, I think it's important that one does raise awareness. What does it mean to pay for a job? What should they look out for? So that when they come across a unsavory character that's recruiting and offering false job opportunities, they can report that to the relevant authority or make other community members aware of that. So really trying to bring it full circle within South Africa, and I'm really excited to see where the program goes now. And obviously engaging more and more around this issue is something that we're looking forward to.
Great. Thank you, Evan. It's great work down there. And I'm sure extraordinarily complicated just given the different layers of workers that are being recruited and different sources of workers. So, Jillian, I thought it would be helpful to give us a bit of an insight into how the Association of Labor Providers and the Stronger Together partnership has worked for you all in the UK in terms of
Yes,
resources and
probably
capacity.
the best way to talk about it is one of my clients, Bakavor, who is a member of the ALP and also been involved with Stronger Together right from the inception. And we've recently, the Bakavor is a Stronger Together business partner, advanced, verified. So we've used the organisational performance assessment process and find the tools really useful to be able to measure where we are and then put together an action plan and then to be able to drive that forward. And we've also looked at it from our labour provider point of view, and we have developed a bespoke audit programme that uses the ALP's core score checklist, which is their compliance operations rating evaluation score checklist. It uses the Stronger Together labour provider checklist as well as the Responsible Recruitment Toolkit self-assessment tool, and it brings it all together, and we have an independent auditor who goes in and audits our labour providers against those standards. So, and the output of that is that we know we have a verified score as to how well they are against all of those standards. And it's we don't require our labour providers to have Clearview accreditation at the moment. We don't know whether we're going to go for that, but it does tell us, because Responsible Recruitment Toolkit is the pillars and the standards that you need to meet in order to get to Clearview accreditation. It tells us how far they are away from that, and then we can decide whether we want to go the whole way or whether we're happy with just what we've got. So we found that's been a really useful way of being able to measure where we are and then drive improvements. The first year we did it, the scores were not very great. We're in year 2 now, and surprisingly, the scores are a lot better. So, and that's what you want to see, because you're not always going to find the right things, not always going to find what you want to see. But if you can then see particularly your labour providers are engaging with the process, they're putting things in place, everything is getting better year on year, then you know you're making progress and that the system and the process is working.
That's great. That's really great. Thank you, Jillian. I just want to thank everyone for participating on this panel, offer some final remarks from each of you, just one takeaway that you have for the audience as we close out this session. Carolyn, I'll start with you.
I just think recognizing again that this is integrative, holistic, and ecosystem of effort, and we all really need to get on board, try to find the incentives for people who are, maybe thinking about dipping a toe in, or others who haven't even really considered it yet. There really is value in looking into your supply chain and ensuring your brand integrity.
Great. Jaron?
Yeah, completely agree with Carolyn's point about this being holistic and all of us needing to work collectively to really drive meaningful progress forward. And I think we've covered a lot of the more process oriented components of what this looks like. And I think from audit, but not losing sight, this is about outcomes, right? And driving positive outcomes for people at the end of the day. And I think this is one aspect as we think about the role of audits, the role of worker voice, of getting to, hey, what's really happening and how are we driving those positive outcomes along with those process improvements. And I think that's one of the major learnings, we've had as we continue to evolve our kind of, more bespoke due diligence on our third party labor providers of, get the policies, the practices, and how do we get better at outcome based metrics and really track the positive impacts we're having, or as long with the negative things that are being mitigated. So just wanted to highlight that focus. There's always a lot of process oriented parts as we talk about recruitment models and things of that nature, but really wanting to highlight the focus on outcomes at the end of the day.
Great. Jillian?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a bit the same, don't we? We agree with everybody. I agree with what Jaron said, and I also agree with what Carolyn said. And I suppose for me, it's about a change of mindset, that people want to do and make a change, and that they don't want to necessarily, you can't do this on your own, that you need to collaborate with other organisations, with organisations like Strong Good Together, Responsible Recruitment, whoever's the most relevant ones in the countries you're in. And there'll be people out there that can help you. So look out for help. Because you can't do it on your own, but actually you need that mindset to want to do the change in the first place. So that would be my takeout.
Thanks, Jillian. And Evan, you want to close us off?
I think from my side, I'm not going to end off in anything too cliche, but just creating more decent work, decent employment opportunities for everyone. And as what the other speaker said, I think all of that is important. So continuously trying to work on the ground, and hopefully we'll see changes in the years to come. So
great. Well, I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you for the audience for joining us on this session. Just to reiterate, Stronger Together is a program that's really committed to working with businesses to help them improve their employment practices and clean up the supply chain around recruitment issues in particular. And we offer a wide range of resources to do that. As we mentioned here, audits and certification are one measure, but we also have the responsible recruitment tool that is a voluntary tool that helps corporations and buyers really look at their supply chain and figure out how they can embed responsible recruitment within the supply chain. And I think the other exciting piece of Stronger Together is just the stakeholder forums that we hold in each country, which brings together not only retailers and growers and distributors and shippers, but also brings labor contractors to the table, which to me is sort of the first of its kind. And being able to have that kind of engagement between what's happening on the ground with labor recruitment alongside with retailers and buyers is just really critical, because there's such an information gap that's happening there that's leading and continuously leading to the exploitation that's occurring on the ground. So really appreciate everyone's time. I hope the audience has enjoyed this incredible panel. Our partners are amazing. We're doing just great work in the field, and really excited to have the opportunity to share what we're doing here today. So thank you for the session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Take care.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.